Why doesn't Rings of Power produced by Amazon feel like Tolkien? Instead, why does it feel more like Disney's Epcot? You might go to Epcot, and if you've ever been in a Norway booth, and you're expecting maybe just a sliver of Norwegian culture, but really all you're going to get is a few warm beers, you're going to get little girls screaming, you're going to get a big veneered church, and you're going to get humidity that just doesn't relent. And it doesn't really give you an authentic taste of what Norway is like. In the same way, Rings of Power doesn't really seem to give us a taste for those of us who've been fortunate enough to read Tolkien's books, or perhaps have even seen Peter Jackson's adaptations of the original trilogy. Um, the series produced by Amazon just doesn't provide the same sort of feeling, atmosphere, doesn't possess the same gravitas as those works. Instead, it seems to me that Rings of Power might best be described as Ersatz Tolkien and Epcot as Ersatz Norway. They're both sort of simulacra, they're both substitutes, they're both attempts to mimic or to mime the original product, yet they deliver something that is inherently inferior. Now our thesis is going to be very simple. Despite its many problems, one reason Rings of Power doesn't feel like Tolkien, and we're not going to talk about canon or breaking the lore, because those are just obvious faults of the product that, I mean, any adaptation is going to face. But, Rings of Power versus the Peter Jackson trilogy, there's not even on the same playing field in terms of canon or lore breaking. But one of the main problems, maybe the salient problem, that Rings of Power doesn't feel like Tolkien is because it fails to induce and sustain what Tolkien calls secondary belief. So here's our basic argument. Good fantasy induces and sustains, in much of its audience, secondary belief in a secondary world. Rings of Power fails to induce and sustain, in a large portion of its audience, secondary belief in a secondary world. Therefore, Rings of Power is not good fantasy. Now, the philosopher Peter Kreeft, who wrote this book, The Philosophy of Tolkien, the worldview behind The Lord of the Rings, he's just an awesome dude. And he, if you ever get to listen to him speak on YouTube or read any of his books, I'd highly recommend tuning into this gentleman. He's extremely wise, extremely humble, extremely just intelligent and erudite. And I love a lot of what he has to say, and I always will listen to what he has to say, even if I ultimately disagree. But in this book, in the introduction, he mentions a feeling that I think a lot of us have had when we first read Lord of the Rings, and whenever we read it again. And for most of us, I think we also kind of get the same feeling, this feeling that's kind of a marker of good fantasy. Now, we get this feeling also when we watch at least portions of the Jackson trilogy. However, I have not had anything remotely like this with regard to Rings of Power, even though I wanted to. So let me just read this briefly. He says, quote, "Many of us can remember where we were when certain tragic historical events occurred in America, such as 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, or Pearl Harbor. Most of us can also remember where we were when we first discovered The Lord of the Rings. We remember the excitement of discovery. Here was a world that was real, in fact more real, more solid than the one we left when we opened the covers of that book. Those covers were magic doors, and we really walked through them into Tolkien's world. They were not just windows to peer through, like cages at a zoo. We were not tourists, but natives. We knew this world. It was our own world, seen more clearly than we had ever seen it before. Exploring Tolkien's world was not just interesting, that all-purpose, meaningless euphemism. It was not even just fascinating. It was sheer joy, for we knew that here we had touched truth. This book was a homecoming. This book broke our hearts." Subsequent readings confirmed the reality and truth of Tolkien's world, and joy rose again like the sun. No one reads The Lord of the Rings only once, and that is the clearest mark of a great book. But when we read secondary sources, books about The Lord of the Rings, we do not feel the same excitement of discovery, joy, and grateful wonder. We do not smell the same sharp smell of truth, even when these books tell us the truth. For we do not want someone else to tell us what Tolkien told us. We don't want summaries of Tolkien. We want Tolkien. So what is it that makes Rings of Power not really feel like Tolkien? Well, in the intro I mentioned an argument about secondary worlds and secondary belief. In this video we're going to look at, in particular, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and he makes a case for what fantasy is, what it ought to be, and what its functions are, and it's an awesome read, and if you love Tolkien you need to read it if you haven't. And maybe if there's any interest at all we can make some more videos diving into various aspects of that essay. But he says, quote, "To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, it will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks. But when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story-making in its primary and most potent mode." So here Tolkien introduces this idea of a secondary world. It's obviously different from the primary world. We live in the primary world, but in fantasy, we're able to enter into, so to speak, a secondary world. And we don't assign it the kind of reality that we assign to the primary. But as Tolkien says here, if the artist is skilled enough in what he calls the elvish crafts, if he instills enough labor and thought, we can accomplish, or they can accomplish, the creation of a secondary world that a person, a viewer, a reader can assign secondary belief to. And this idea of secondary belief is definitely different from what Tolkien is going to call a suspension of disbelief. When I read Lord of the Rings, for example, I don't have to pretend that the characters aren't real, per se. I take them to exist, but in their own world, not mine. I obviously don't think that Gandalf exists in the primary world, of course, like my paternal grandfather does. But when I read Tolkien, it feels like I'm reading another history of another world, as if I've been blessed to catch a glimpse of this sort of like parallel universe. Thus, Tolkien might say that I have a secondary belief in his secondary world. Now, here's the essential, I think, point, or the quote from his essay on fairy stories where this point is made. Tolkien writes, quote, "Children are capable, of course, of literary belief," meaning kind of like secondary belief, when the story maker's art is good enough to produce it. And that state of mind has been called a willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. However, he writes, the moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather the art, has failed. You're then out in the primary world again, looking at that little abortive secondary world from outside. If you are obliged by kindliness or circumstance to stay, then disbelief must be suspended or stifled. Otherwise, listening and looking would become intolerable. But this suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing. It's a subterfuge we use when condescending to games or make-believe, or when trying, more or less willingly, to find what virtue we can in the work of an art that, for us, has failed. This is a sort of a damning indictment, and this is where I think Tolkien describes what I've come to see as like the essential flaw in adaptations such as Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, not Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power by Amazon Prime. And no, I'm not going to defend Lord of the Rings or the Jackson trilogy as if they're beyond any criticism. And I do adore them. They played a formative role in my sort of like upbringing when I was a young man. I love them very much, and they have a special place in my heart. But they're not beyond criticism here. Like there are things about them that I think similar critiques that we'll make here, could apply to. But from my experience, at least when watching Rings of Power, I almost always find myself in the primary world looking at the secondary world that J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay are trying to create. And I could be accused of confirmation bias. Maybe I don't like the series. I don't want to like it because I've predisposed myself to watch for, things in the production that, catch my attention and justify my bias against it. And all I can say in response is that I didn't begin watching it with the hope that it would be bad or that it would fail. But after 2 seasons, I've come to the conclusion that it is bad, and I wouldn't be angry if it did fail, for reasons that we're going to elaborate in a little bit. But back to Tolkien's point, when we watch the show, I find myself in disbelief, right? I'm sitting in my chair looking at it, and I don't believe in it. I don't believe that what I'm watching is true or real in any sense. There's no inner consistency to it that I am assenting to or believing to be true. So I find myself in disbelief, but if I want to keep watching, I have to actively suspend it. But remember, for Tolkien, if we have to suspend belief, this is a poor excuse for, quote, the genuine thing, meaning secondary belief. It's a subterfuge we use when condescending, he says, to games or make-believe, or when trying, more or less willingly, to find what virtue we can in the work of an art that for us has failed. And for me, Rings of Power is a work of art that has failed. But why does the spell break for me when I watch Rings of Power but not usually when I watch the Jackson trilogy, and not at all when I read the Silmarillion or Lord of the Rings. And it seems to me that Rings of Power is a poor attempt at what Tolkien calls sub-creation. Tolkien writes, "The achievement of the expression, which gives, or seems to give, the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing, or aspect, needing another name. Art, the operative link between imagination and the final result, sub-creation. For my present purpose I require a word which shall embrace both the sub-creative art in itself, and a quality of the strangeness and wonder in the expression derived from the image, a quality essential to fairy story. I propose therefore to use fantasy for this purpose." Here Tolkien describes the nature of fantasy as both the craft or art by which secondary worlds, possessing the quote, inner consistency of reality, are born, but also as the experience of strangeness and wonder when witnessing the imaginative expression of this art or craft. In a different section, Tolkien writes, quote, "We need a word for this elvish craft, but all the words that have been applied to it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, but magic should be reserved for the operations of a magician. Art is the human process that produces secondary belief. But the more potent and specially elvish craft I will, for lack of a less debatable word, call enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But in its purity it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces, or pretends to produce, an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal. It remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills." To the elvish craft enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, of all forms of human art, most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of the elves lies, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art, which, however much it may outwardly resemble it, is inwardly wholly different from the greed for self-centered power, which is the mark of the mere magician. Now, perhaps in another video we could talk about Tolkien's philosophy of magic because it's super interesting. But right now we're zeroing in on secondary worlds and secondary beliefs. So, regarding Rings of Power, the deck might be stacked against it from Tolkien's perspective because he says that fantasy is, quote, "a thing best left to words, to true literature. It is a misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it, or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes, we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. Drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. Dramatic fantasy is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere vestigiary framework for farce, and no, quote, belief of any kind in any part of the performance is required or expected of anybody." Now, an obvious problem with Rings of Power, if we follow the Tolkien here, is that it is dramatic, inherently dramatic. Video adaptations of written works, whether they be film or TV shows, are audibly acted, visibly acted, and they are captured via camera and microphone. And again, we could discuss the merits and success of Jackson's trilogy, but that isn't the focus here. But if we had to consider Jackson's trilogy and Rings of Power on like a continuum tier list of fantasy, I would obviously rank Lord of the Rings way far above Rings of Power. Now, while dramatic production may be moving and in a sense magical in its own way, like I've seen various stage plays that have left me in tears, for example, and made like very lasting impressions on me, and I highly recommend that folks attend the local theater. They never will, however, Tolkien seems to think, possess the same kind of power that the written narrative does, that power to create fantasy. But why is drama so ineffective at weaving the spell Tolkien hopes to weave? Why are writers or actors, props, and CGI doomed to leave us longing for something else? Tolkien writes, "A reason more important is this. Drama has, of its very nature, already attempted a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least a substitute, magic. The visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. That is in itself an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand, to introduce, even with mechanical success into this quasi-magical secondary world, a further fantasy or magic is to demand, as it were, an inner or tertiary world. It is a world too much. Now, I've made this silly little infograph type of thing here. I'm trying to like relay what I think Tolkien's talking about. But on the left, we have the dramatic thought experiment that Tolkien is talking about. So at the bottom of the primary world, it's you sitting in the theater waiting for the play to start. Then the secondary world is the drama itself, like the actions of the people dressed up in costumes, all the props, the stage, all of that stuff. And you're being asked as a viewer to pretend that these men in costumes are actually other men, right? Like a dude on the stage is dressed up as Hamlet. We're supposed to pretend he's Hamlet for the sake of this production. And then the tertiary world that Tolkien imagines is this sort of like anytime fantastical or magical elements are introduced within that story. So it's a further con, it's a further prop, it's a further imagining that you have to take part in and pretend about, which he thinks sort of makes the whole enterprise tenuous and the illusion more likely to break, and therefore you less likely to assign to it the secondary belief that you would, say, a written narrative. On the right-hand side, I tried to put what might be some problems with a production like Rings of Power. And so you have the primary world, you sitting on the couch or whatever. The secondary world would be the show itself, the drama. You're pretending that these men and women are in costumes are other characters, like we're pretending that Morfydd Clark is Galadriel. And I'm not going to make comments about the casting decision there or the characterization. I think it was, I mean, no, this isn't to offend Morfydd, but I think the decisions were lamentable there with both casting and characterization. But then the tertiary world would be any like fantastical, again, or magical elements, things that, you know, don't happen in our world, but that could happen in theirs, that, you know, they use CGI or different effects to achieve in the show. But then my, I guess, little contribution here is like there's like a fourth world here, quaternary world. I don't know if that's the right word to choose. I just kind of said it. But in the show, I noticed, especially in season 2, this insistence on referencing other material. And in that sense, Rings of Power becomes like a hyperlinked work from my perspective. Like, it's no longer a self-contained secondary reality. It's trying to, in a sense, reference other things, but these things aren't themselves like primary worlds. They're themselves media productions. So like, whenever we're going to look at a few scenes, the show references, whether it's the Jackson movies, a line from the Tolkien, you know, books, or even like Star Wars or something. To me, like they're breaking the fourth wall. They're winking at the camera, winking at you, the audience, and that really breaks for me the immersion. It breaks this idea of secondary belief, and it shoves me straight back into the primary world where I'm looking at the production. I'm not believing it in a sense. I'm not assigning any sort of reality to it. Now, to be fair, drama, especially a show trying to adapt Tolkien's mythos, which is a Herculean endeavor, implicitly asks of its writers, actors, editors, and producers to conjure within us, the audience, the same sort of enchantment that Tolkien's words can. And this order is obviously too tall. I mean, even Jackson's trilogy couldn't evoke the same kind of wonder, enchantment, longing, and desire that the Silmarillion can invoke in me, or the Lord of the Rings can invoke in me. And if we're being fair, we shouldn't expect them to, because it just simply can't be done. A dramatic production is a dramatic production. It's an adaptation. No matter how many dollars you pour into hiring like unknown actors to star in your show, or hiring disciples of J.J. Abrams and his mysterious box to write a show for you, or, you know, set design or CGI effects, whatever, we should not expect the same precise experience of Tolkien's written work that we do of the film or TV adaptations. I mean, that's obvious. I'm not making that exact parallel, but I am trying to assess why Rings of Power on its own seems to fall short. And it's like, yeah, some adaptations could be more faithful to Tolkien's canon than others. That's absolutely obvious. Some adaptations could be more faithful to the spirit of Tolkien and his ethos than others. And some adaptations, forgetting any sort of adherence to Tolkien or his spirit, might just feel more authentic on their own terms than others. And insofar as I'm concerned, Rings of Power feels incredibly inauthentic. The, quote, inner consistency of reality is entirely lacking from my perspective. I'm looking at the secondary world and forcing myself to suspend disbelief. But why? And so there are a few screen clippings that I just kind of pulled from the show that, I just remember watching and feeling just totally torn out of the moment. And this is one of them. I think it's like episode 2 or something, when the Harfoots, the not hobbits, are hiding from these desert sand people, and they hide beneath their little cloaks. Okay, and obviously, as soon as I watch this, I'm thrown straight back to Sam and Frodo hiding beneath their elvish cloaks from the eastern soldiers. And for me, this, first of all, the visual reference immediately makes me think of the other product, the other piece of media, and therefore I'm no longer thinking about the story. I'm thinking about the product and the media. I'm thinking about the design choices, the production choices here. But number 2, I also know that these cloaks aren't magic elvish cloaks in the show, and I have the sneaking suspicion that they don't actually look like rocks or bushes, but the camera and the way that the plot, plays out, we're just supposed to believe that this dude looking straight at them and their little, cloak dome, they're not spotted, and we're just supposed to believe that, and that's going to be good enough for us, and we're going to just be forced to move on in the plot and say, nope, didn't see him, totally missed him. The hobbits are great at hiding, right? And for me, I didn't buy it for a variety of reasons. Like I said, the references to other media, the inner consistency part of the story itself. And so, to me, this is just sort of like the kind of things I'm going to reference here are, from my perspective, symptomatic of the product as a whole. And in the comments, if anybody watches this and you've had similar experiences, or you make similar observations, please let me know. I wonder if this is sort of idiosyncratic to me, or if other people kind of had the same experience. A second scene. I think this might be episode 4 or whatever. I forget, but it's Pharazôn whenever he's crowned king or whatever over Muriel. And again, we're not talking about canon or anything like that, but essentially, you have a coup that takes all this place of 5 minutes, and everyone's just like, the eagle has come, and then the plants in the crowd are like, Pharazôn, Pharazôn, and start chanting, and then everyone else, all the peasants, start chanting, Pharazôn, and we're just supposed to okay, a sea change here is occurring, and no one is upset about it. We have a king, so to speak, replacing a queen by coup, and the people of Numenor are just okay with that. They just roll with it, and no one really bats an eye. And then there's that whole plot line between Elendil and his daughter, right? And she betrays him essentially, but then later we're supposed to feel sad when she starts crying. She's like, oh dad, I don't want you to go with the faithful or risk yourself. Why do you have to resist Pharazôn? Yet she sold him out earlier and everyone else. But this is supposed to be some sort of dramatic moment, and we're supposed to feel empathetic and stuff like that. But yeah, and also, I don't have pictures from the rest of the scene, but the set design here and the cast seems very small. And some other YouTuber, I think Scriptmage, who puts out some great stuff, she did a great analysis of this scene and compared it to the coronation scene from Game of Thrones. And she's dead on. This scene is shot all weird. Everything seems small. Everything's rushed. Everything is sort of just forced, and just to get the plot moving forward. Whereas I'm not a Game of Thrones fan at all, but she analyzes the scene, and as a scene, as a piece of screenwriting and production, it definitely is superior. It has more heft, has more weight. All right, this scene, I think, this is the one where she's fighting the orcs, and she's go back to the shadow. As soon as she said it, I groaned audibly watching this. This is one of those examples of repurposing the lines from Tolkien or even the Jackson movies as presented to, lots of the audience who are watching this show have probably seen the movies, if not read the books. And so go back to the shadow, right? Where do we hear that? We hear that from Gandalf on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm when he's talking to the Balrog of Morgoth, right? And it's sort of like surrounded with this context that, I'm a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor, right? And Gandalf starts like invoking essentially like, his station as a Maya, and invoking like the power of Eru Ilúvatar, like the creator of all things. And it becomes this battle of like good versus evil in an angelic sense, it's like epic, and he says go back to the shadow, and like he curses the Balrog, and it has all this weight, all this heft, all this gravitas. And here they just throw that line into Galadriel's mouth, and she's like, go back to the shadow, talking to a bunch of orcs in the woods that she just kind of chose to go fight and definitely didn't have to do that. And so to me, it was just a cheap callback. It's a reference, but again, what it does is it makes me think of the production, the Lord of the Rings production from Jackson, and it reminds me of that scene. And not only does it remind me of how much better that other scene was and how much more impactful and important it was, but it also makes me look at the Rings of Power as a product. Again, it makes me suspend my disbelief. I have to sit there looking at the secondary world they're trying to create. I'm not participating in it. I'm not perceiving it as like a spectator. I am looking at the show on my screen as a show on my screen. I'm not being caught up in the fantasy. One of the most egregious scenes, I think, would be the scene between Bombadil and Gandalf. We all know that the stranger's going to be Gandalf, but they're doing the whole mystery box thing, like, who's it going to be throughout the whole show, and it's just like, that's how they drive tension, I guess, is, we've got to figure out the mystery. But here we see Tom Bombadil, which, most people think he never should have been in the show. Jackson thought it wasn't doable, and I think that, what's his name, Kinnear, I forget his first name, but his performance, I'm sorry, like, to me, just feels really ham-fisted. The accent is totally awkward, and it's distracting, and he's like, the Dark Wizard found his stuff, like, now it's time to find yours, and it's just like, I don't know what the hell that's supposed to be. But, focusing on the actual scene. Here, we get this whole sort of, like, Empire Strikes Back thing with Luke and Yoda, where, Gandalf's like, I have to go, save these people, and then Tom Bombadil's like, oh, but you have two paths, and who knows, what kind of things will happen, and you gotta find your destiny, and but then I think, the grave sin here is that he quotes to Gandalf the scene that Gandalf, from the scene, the line that Gandalf speaks to Frodo in the Mines of Moria, but he gets it wrong. I think in the show he says, many that die deserve life, some that live deserve death. Who are you to give it to them? Kind of like a who are you type of thing, And to me that just seems antithetical to like the ethos of Tolkien and the spirit of Tolkien. Originally Gandalf says to Frodo, many that live deserve death, some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? And it's the context of that scene is about pity. It's about sparing the life of Gollum. It's about the wise, like Gandalf himself, not being able to see all ends. It's about being charitable. It's about being merciful, and sort of trusting in this hand of providence that's bigger than you are, in order to, like, not be too quick to deal out death in judgment. But this scene inverts it. Instead of many that die deserving, many that, live deserving death, it's many that die deserve life, some that live deserve death, right? He kind of inverts this idea of like the wickedness of man and all these other things, but whatever. But the scene itself, the fact that it's a callback to, for most people, the movies, they're going to think about Gandalf in the Mines of Moria, and they're going to think about, the words of Tolkien himself. But that callback breaks the fourth wall again. It's a reference, and again, it makes me look at the work as a work. It doesn't entice me. It doesn't inspire me. It just makes me think that they're scrambling for lines, and they're trying to sound like Tolkien, and the best they can do is repurpose, but also misrepresent a line from Gandalf in the Mines of Moria. Here we get their version of the Ride of the Rohirrim. Like, they just want to have the charge. It seems to me that's what I thought as soon as I saw this. It was just like, oh, they have to have a big horse charge too. But then it gets like, totally just trounced because, oh, they have Galadriel in a cage and then the charge has to stop, but they still want like the grandeur of the shot, I guess. Even though the woods and stuff make it seem so small, like it like really shortens up the scene. But they have all the horses, and how many CGI, I have no idea, if any. But yeah, like, cool shot. But again, what does it make me think of? It doesn't make me think of, oh, Elrond coming to save the day, leading this, charge of horses. The first thought I had was Ride of the Rohirrim, right? They want to have their own sort of like big grand horse shot. Here's a scene I think from well, I'm contrasting season 1 Eregion to season 2 Eregion. But this is just demonstrative of like the inner consistency problem, like where things just don't make sense in its own world. And this is small, but like Tolkien was super into world building, and it really makes the world believable whether you're consciously thinking about it or not, right? Would I have caught this probably if I didn't see other people point it out? Maybe not, but there are other like consistency problems that immediately jar me out of the world. And as an aside, I don't want to get too much into this, but some people talk about like the racial casting, like the diversity casting in productions, like seeing all the different like races representing different human races. So like in the dwarves, different colored dwarves, and elves, like a variety of like ethnically diverse elves. And in and of itself, like that's not a bad thing, to cast people, various ethnicities in your roles. But there could be an argument made that it breaks the inner consistency of the world, right? Like Tolkien is trying to create essentially this, among other reasons, a mythology of England. And, when you think mythology of England, you're not going to be thinking, of people who are not white European, folks. And whenever you have like the diversity of human actors being representing different elves or whatever, it can be jarring in the sense that you're removed from the secondary belief, from the fantasy of it all, because you're thinking about the casting decisions. You're thinking about, wow, this looks a lot more like metropolitan New York City than it does what I'd expect if I was in some like remote fantasy realm, for example, like Middle Earth. And so like that's an inner consistency problem. I think that there's a legitimate criticism to be made there, but it's not. I think if it comes from a place of racial derision or something, obviously that kind of criticism is anathema. Like that can't be legitimate. But if it comes from an inner consistency perspective, I think there's something to be made there. But I'm not making that point. I'm just saying that there's something to be made there. However, season 1, Eregion, on the left, no walls, right? No walls at all. Season 2, we got walls. Why do we have walls in season 2? There's one main reason. They need a battle. They want that battle to be precisely like an analogy for Helm's Deep, right? The showrunners even said that. We need a Helm's Deep battle. So between season 1 and season 2, they force the wall into the, building of Eregion, meaning that we're supposed to believe that it always had walls because we're never shown that it's being built or whatever. And it's like, I guess that's fine, but it's just demonstrative of the inner consistency problem that I think the show has in a variety of different facets, not just this one. This one's relatively minor, actually. But it's just trying to force drama, trying to force the viewers to, hopefully make, what would you call them? Like positive comparisons between Rings of Power and the Jackson trilogy, which I think the Battle of Eregion was just really a letdown compared to the Battle of Helm's Deep. Lots of problems with like, the method of draining the river seemed really cheesy, unbelievable. Crossing the riverbed seemed cheesy, unbelievable. Horses get stuck in mud. Orc siege machines don't. This weird siege machine that's just the opposite of a battering ram, like attacks the weakest point at the wall because I need a weakest point at the wall because there was one of those at Helm's Deep, like the little gate, culvert beneath the stone wall, and then we have the explosives that the folks at Helm's Deep just weren't expecting Saruman to have conjured, and it's like there's all this stuff in there, but they're like, oh, we gotta make it like that was epic, like this will be epic too if we do it this way. But the problem is that in the books and then in Jackson's trilogy, and I know the elves showed up in the Jackson trilogy, I'm not defending that decision, but the battle itself had an inner logic and inner consistency that just compelled you, the viewer, to believe it, right? You have to think about it. But then, with the Siege of Eregion, you're obviously in your head comparing it to Helm's Deep, and I think it just doesn't nearly deliver on the same scale. So, another scene demonstrative of various issues. Speaking of the Battle of Eregion, in this scene we get the infamous female soldier that we know nothing about getting Boromired, and again, audible groans when I saw that on my TV. Just come on, man. Just so cheap. It's a callback. Doesn't seem nearly as heroic, but it's also a double callback, because he's like, take the shot, and it's that's Legolas killing the orc who's charging the explosives underneath the wall at Helm's Deep. So it's both Boromir and Legolas at the same time. It's a callback to both in one scene with someone we care nothing about, in a relatively making an inconsequential action. Yes, it destroys the siege machine, but it's okay, they're already invading, whatever. So just the attempt to force this heroism upon us, the attempt to make it look epic or whatever, it just seems cheap. It just seems like they're really reaching here. They're grasping too hard, and it just doesn't. It's unbecoming, I think, of good fantasy writers, and it's unbecoming of good television. And here we see Adar stab Arondir, and we're presuming that he, gets killed here. But then in the next episode, guess what? Arondir shows up, and perfectly fine, no explanation at all. And you as the viewer are left wondering, well, how the heck did that happen? And it just goes on, no explanation, nothing at all. You're just expected to, again, eat it up, slurp it up, and pretend that it makes sense, pretend that it's good drama, pretend that all of this production amounts to something remotely resembling passable fantasy. So, these different scenes we looked at, again, these are not exhaustive. Maybe my analysis is totally off base, I have no idea. But these just seem to be some criticisms that I think are illustrative of that idea of the secondary world not being built correctly, not being built believably, not being built in such a way that you as a viewer can assign secondary belief to it, probably in a way that forces you, the viewer, to suspend disbelief in a variety of ways. So if you guys can think of any other scenes, any other aspects of the show that for you forced you to suspend disbelief, or really sort of pulled you out of that secondary world and into the primary world looking at the TV screen, things that broke your immersion, things that left you feeling sort of hollow, empty, whatever. I'd love to hear about it. I'll discuss with you in the comments below. Now, it stands to reason that some fans might be able to watch Rings of Power, consume it without their sense of immersion breaking. Some might have genuine secondary belief in the world of J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, even though I find that doubtful. Some might just be willing to watch the show and suspend their disbelief because they want or need to distract themselves. They want something to consume, something to watch, and this has Tolkien's name slapped on it. Parts of his legendarium are slapped on it, and that is good enough for them. But in any case, I obviously am not one of those fans. I find the series entirely unenchanting. It is ultimately not a work of fantasy. It is a work, I think, of corporate greed masquerading as fantasy. Now, this line of critique doesn't really delineate or explore Tolkien's views about what fantasy is or what its purposes or functions are. In this video, I only sought to describe one particular symptom of the show, and that is, for me, at least, it is unable to induce or sustain secondary belief. This problem, I think, exposes a variety of issues within the show, problems of characterization, of motivation, of consistency, and problems of comporting with Tolkien's ethos and mythos. And we could make separate videos diving into each of these and more, and I might really like to do that. But nothing about Rings of Power feels like Tolkien to me. I don't sense his elvish craft in its bones. I only sense Jeff Bezos' attempt to further pad his pockets. And if you know anything about Tolkien's views on technology or industrial society, you will sense the irony in Amazon, an incredibly wealthy megacorporation, acquiring the rights from the Tolkien estate. May God have mercy on their souls to produce this egregious work of fan fiction. Bezos wanted Rings of Power to be his own Game of Thrones. And this is a desire that's not one of subcreation, to create and enter into a beautiful secondary world, but it's rather a lust for power and wealth. And just as a side note, Martin's mythos is like an anti-Tolkien, and he's spoken about this, and you can kind of Google that for yourself. So whatever. But Martin isn't really interested in questions of like nobility and justice, heroism and sacrifice, truth and beauty, good and evil. He's much more interested in being like, you know, realistic and exploring different other facets. And I'm not saying they're bad pieces of fiction. I'm just saying that they're not fantasy in the same way that Tolkien's fantasy is enchanting, so to speak. Now, I want to leave you with a few thoughts from Tolkien as we conclude this overly long video. Tolkien wrote in his essay, quote, "Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for nor obscure the perception of scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts, or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever get into that state, it would not seem at all impossible. Fantasy will perish and become morbid delusion." I don't think that Rings of Power is very reasonable. It doesn't seem internally consistent. I feel like Tolkien's world is when I read Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, or even watching various parts of, you know, Jackson's trilogy. It seems unreasonable to me. It seems forced. It seems unenchanting. Now, Tolkien offers a word of warning. He says, "Fantasy can, of course, be carried to excess. It can be ill done. It can be put to evil uses. It may even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing in this fallen world is that not true? Men have conceived not only of elves, but they have imagined gods and worshipped them, even worshipped those most deformed by their author's own evil. But they have made false gods out of other materials. Their notions, their banners, their monies, even their sciences and their social and economic theories have demanded human sacrifice. Abusus non tollit usum. Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our own measure and in our own derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." Now that sounds like a topic for another video. However, if you like this analysis, please consider liking and subscribing, all that stuff. I have never made a video before, and this might have been a total, like, just train wreck of a thing. I have no idea. And it might be totally worthless and not worthwhile. But I thought it'd be fun to do, and it's just something that was kind of like on my mind and really just pounding around there. And I was like, what if I just put this out there? Because a lot of other people are putting their thoughts out there, and this might be like a window just into, you know, making a niche channel with, you know, nerdy, philosophical, literary analysis and stuff like that, with a sort of philosophical lens on all of it. So if you like this idea, like this video, please let me know. And if you have any other ideas about the show or other aspects of Tolkien's philosophy of fantasy you'd like to tackle, let me know. But I just want to summarize briefly what the main argument was and why I think it wasn't good fantasy. So, good fantasy induces and sustains in much of its audience a secondary belief in a secondary world. Rings of Power fails to induce and sustain in a large portion of its audience secondary belief in a secondary world. This is for reasons of hyperlinking, of referencing other media productions, problems of inconsistency, characterization, things that pull you out of the secondary world into the primary, looking at the, quote, little abortive secondary world from the outside. To me, there are so many aspects of the show that do that, and therefore, I think 3, Rings of Power is not good fantasy. Let me know if you agree with the analysis. Let me know what you guys think of Rings of Power. Yeah, thanks for watching, and until next time, if there is a next time.